thank you all for tuning in. Yes, this is my Self-Care Wednesdays. Yes, my Self-Care Wednesdays. Where I check in the middle of the week, just to, see if everything is straight, and that's what I normally do in the middle of the week. You personally don't have to do that, but that's just something that I do, and that's why I chose Wednesday to be, Self-Care Wednesdays for me. And, outside of even before I started this podcast, that's something that I did on a personal level. So I just chose to bring, some of my tips and some of my steps to you all. Yes, and I also wanted to just add to that, I apologize for the upload of my Self-Care Wednesdays, which are not, mostly some of them are not on a Wednesday. But however, I ran into some technical difficulties during the middle of the week, which is crazy. It happens every time. But however, hopefully, next week everything will be rectified. But in the meantime, subscribe, guys. Subscribe to my podcast, and you will be the first to know when I drop an episode. I am on all your favorite streaming platforms where you get your podcasts. I am on Spotify. Yes, I am on iTunes. I am on TuneIn. I'm on Google Play. I'm on iHeartRadio. I'm everywhere. So if you want to know where you get your favorite streaming podcasts at and where you would like to listen to, you can also Google my podcast name. Yes, my podcast name. Of course, you are listening to the Creative Lips Podcast. Yes, and I am your host, Regina. Yes. So, you can just Google that, and it'll be sure to pop up everywhere, and also on your social media as well. Yes. So, yeah, I thank you all for tuning in, all of the new listeners and all of the active listeners. I really appreciate you all. Yes, we're all making it through these weeks. Yes, we're almost halfway in, the middle of April. Believe it or not. Yes, we're making it through this month. I know by now the COVID-19 coronavirus, strain, everything has been embedded in our minds and in our spirits. We will never forget this, just like I said, is history. It's history in the making. And we will never forget about this time in our lives, because we are here to see it. And even the young ones, we can talk to them and explain to them what's going on. And, we are making it through. We are definitely making it through. And I also want to add, which I always say, before I start my podcast, is a couple of things that I normally say. Now, I just want to say to all of my listeners who are new and who are active, who have been listening to me already, that if you are going through something, only you know what you're going through right now. And I know times is really rough right now, with what's going on in the world with this pandemic. And even if it wasn't a pandemic, we still have trials. We still have obstacles. We still have things that we need to overcome, whether it be personal, whether it be, emotionally, whether it be financially, whether it be physically. Only you know what those are. I hope and pray, and I know that you will make it through. You all will make it through. Yes, who's ever listening to this, I want you to hear this. You will make it through victorious. You will make it out and you will be that warrior. Yes, you will be that warrior because you can trust yourself. You know more than you think. You will make it through. Yes, so I just wanted to get into a little bit about the topic that I'm going to be talking about today. The different steps that, that I have experience in. So now before I get into, talking about the steps, it's 4 steps. I just wanted to, give a little bit of a disclaimer. A disclaimer, basically saying that on this podcast, if you're listening to, my self-care Wednesdays, when I talk about my self-care Wednesdays, that, this is just from my experience. I am in no way, no shape, no form, a licensed psychologist or a licensed therapist. Okay, I, am just, talking from my own experience and for entertainment purposes only. And, you never know. When you listen to some of my steps and tips, you never know. You might get something that may help you. And by all means, feel free to reach out to me if it makes an impact. If any of my self-care Wednesdays resonate with you and they make an impact. And even if you just want to sound off and say, hey, Regina, I don't want you talking about that shit no more. You know what I'm saying? So, it really doesn't matter. But however, we want to hope and pray, that I want to hope and pray that everything, that I say on my self-care Wednesdays, helps you in some way, some shape, in some form. It helps you get through, so I just wanted to put that out there in the universe and let you all know that. Okay. So now I want to talk about this topic, because this is something that I have been battling a lot in my life and still battling, but however, I just handle it better now. So, every day we come into contact with energy. Yes. Whether it be, what's around us and, and what we see and what we feel, like our emotions or, just anything that has to do with energy. Energy can greatly influence our mood and positive well-being on a daily basis. Yes. Whether you feel that bad vibe coming from someone else or you feel it lingering in a room you just walked in. Some of us, not all of us, but some of us can sense that, especially, when you, whether it be, I can give 2 different scenarios. Whether it be at home with your significant other, you can sense when something's wrong. Or whether it be at work, you can sense when something's wrong with your coworkers. Many of us spend so much of our lives allowing ourselves to get swept away by others people's energies, whether it be good or whether it be bad, y'all. For those of us who are highly sensitive or empaths like myself, I wouldn't say that I'm highly sensitive, but I pick up on a lot of things. Like you can just text me, I can just pick up on that text and those words, I can just pick up and sense, especially from a tone of voice. I can just pick it up, It's so easy to soak up the world around us, leaving us eventually drained and exhausted. Definitely exhausted. Along with your physical energy, there's your emotional, mental, and spiritual energy. When you're lacking in energy, it's when you don't feel like you have enough of something and you to continue on a daily task. Sometimes it's hard for us to do that. When you don't, have that physical energy to do it because of that negative energy that's not positive. You pick up on it. It becomes hard for us. Yes, some of us, we can't, begin to, start over again or to figure out, where to begin. It's not just about having or really not having any energy. It's about figuring out how to access positive energy and letting it flow throughout our entire body. How can we do that? Now, I can tell you a brief little bit of story before I get into the steps. Many years before I knew anything about this energy, energy stuff that I talk about a lot. I talk about energy. I talk about manifestations. I talk about empaths. I talk about all of that stuff that has a lot to do with the law of attraction. It has a lot to do with the universe, and stuff like that. Many years before I knew about anything, about stuff like that, and also even protecting your energy, I reflected on the fact that how many work days were stressful. I would come home and just just think about my work days and how they were so stressful. They were just so stressful. It wasn't, something that I felt as though that was agreeing with my soul and my spirit. Hence, that's why my name is Gina Like Soul, But, I had to try, to take back, the time. So, because it was once when, I got home, from a long day of stressful work. I had to take care of my home, my children, leaving no downtime for myself. I was being pulled every way that I was needed. And it was hard to prevent that burnout. It was hard for me to prevent that burnout phase and leave little time for myself. Then, once that happens, eventually self-doubt started to kick in, just like I told you all before. If you listen to my other self-care Wednesdays, I had very low self-esteem, and when that self-doubt kicks in, it can be easily overlooked as negative energy that affects us and takes over. And that's what happened to me back then. And then I tended not to have a positive outlook on everything. I always had like a self-doubt about a lot of things. Like, I never looked at stuff in a positive way because my energy, my equilibrium, my balance was just completely off, So now in this episode, just like I said, I'm going to share my 4 steps on how to stay positive and protect your energy in the midst of anything. And it's possible. You can do it. All right, so now let's get into step number 1. Step number 1 is redirect your mind frame. I know that when you hear that, you're like, how do I redirect my mind frame? How do I do that? Now, in all saying that, you can change how you think. Change how you think on a daily basis. It is very beneficial, y'all. I'm telling you, if you can practice this, it's really about how quickly you can redirect your focus from negative to positive. That's what it really is. Critical thinkers are going to see problems to be solved, but the ability to reframe the conversation is really an important skill for people to practice. If we can just take some time and practice this, much of the time, a bad day or a bad part of the day will get defined by the way we frame the information, the way things are interpreted. We define things as binary. We have a binary mind. Good, we think about the good things, or we think about the bad things. Now, that's our binary mind. Happy or sad. Up or down. Those are the binary functions in our mind. Now, in a positive way, for protecting your energy, keep in mind these things. There are different techniques that we can apply to our daily life to help us train our mind so that we can think about things in a positive light and protect our energy. Now, the techniques, you can use these at any time when you start to feel a sense of negative energy welling up inside of you, like you feel it. Like it could be a situation that you just encountered with a person, or it could be anything in your personal life, with whatever is going on in your life that's in a negative light. You can practice those tips. At the beginning of each day, set one intention for your day. Intentions are like, intentions are like objects that are aligned with the person you wish to be, and as such, they aren't meant to be a part of a to-do list, like you create a list for your groceries. No. These things, these intentions have a meaning. They are connected to your feeling, the way you feel. The feeling of being a better person. Simply take a moment, y'all. Simply just take a moment, y'all, and think of things that make you smile inside. Things that make you feel warmer or happier, more connected to others. Being better. Just being a better person to yourself. Or you can also think about things that that's going to calm you down. And y'all know some of those things is, you know what I'm saying? But however, make a list of all of these things. Chances are, you never know, they will align your spirit. And if they do, then it's going to be a reflection in the image that you will be in a better light. Now, if you all can make sure that, these are daily intentions. These intentions have to have that meaning. Daily intentions for you to do that. This has to be a list. And you have to get it done too. It has to be a to-do list for you to get those things done. It has to be a no-brainer. It has to be something that like clockwork, like you do it each and every day. Because by simply setting this intention, you will feel better about your day, and you will be more connected to the intention of your day. End your day by counting your wins. Just before you go to bed each and every night, take a moment to count your wins for that day. Take a moment to count all of the things that you accomplished through those intentions about being good to yourself. Pat yourself on the back for those things. And some of the things that you can say, I can give you an example. What were a few of the things you accomplished today? What were a few of the things you felt really good about experiencing? Or what were some of the things you did that aligned you, that made you center, that made you at peace, that protected your energy in a positive way? Make sure you write down those intentions, y'all. All those intentions, so that you can be a better person in the end. And also make sure you write down the one intention you accomplish, so you ponder your connection to that feeling, especially. The more you are connected to your intentions over time, the more powerful they will become. All right, guys? So make sure you do that. Try to redirect and reframe your mind. This will help you protect yourself at all costs. It will help you protect yourself in a very, very, very big positive light. All right, guys? All right, so now step number 2, create a positive environment. Yes, okay, so now it is vital to have a positive, people around you who will help you stay positive in negative situations, right? Your environment says a lot about you. If you don't have the positive people around you, and now also down to when you leave those people, you go home. You have to have a positive environment at home too. So if we can control our environment and creating a safe, orderly space also offers physical, emotional, and spiritual health benefits too, if we do this at home. Now, often the best place to start, of course, just like I said, is at home. Now, if we do this, if we start by creating that environment that it is of protection, because it protects our sacred space with positivity, where we can have a greater measure of control and authority if we do that at home. The first step to do at home in creating a positive environment is decluttering and letting go of excess in your home. Now, I know once I had left my previous relationship, I had a lot of decluttering I had to do. And I'm still going through a lot of decluttering right now as we speak. But however, I had a lot of decluttering and I got rid of a lot of things, that was of no meaning to me, because, the clutter can accumulate for a variety of reasons. It can. Sometimes people hold on to stuff that they don't need to hold on to. And it could be very detrimental to our health as well. It could also talk about how we feel inside as well. If we hold on to a lot of things, especially, when you see those television shows, the hoarders. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Once you remove the things you don't use, need, or love, you want to go back through your space. We want to go back through that space and organize what remains. And once you've eliminated excess and organized what you truly need to keep around, then you can look for opportunities to make space more for peaceful and a welcoming environment once you do that. It's one thing that I love to do. Like once I decluttered a lot of stuff, I incorporated, I always did, but it's even better. I do this by adding aromatherapy. Aromatherapy, like making the place smell good. I love it. Like I have to walk like every room. Every room has to smell good. Like my sense is very heightened. So, like, if you're in my company, just word to the wise who trying to shoot that shot, but word to the wise. My nose is very sensitive. So I love stuff that smells good because, aromatherapy can have a positive impact on mood, holistic health, but it's important not to try and hide the mess, by covering them up with something more pleasant, and, a lot of y'all out there do that. I don't want to name no names, but however, a lot of, people out there do that. They try to spray, or spritz, when they need to clean that shit. You know what I'm saying? But however, getting back and get off topic, but, aromatherapy is really good. It's a really good way to, especially when you're meditating. I love to use, good scents, whether it be burning oils, candles, incense, that's something that I love to do. And, once again, as I started it off before, like having your friends around you, people who support you, also a circle of good friends. My circle is small, but, however, if you want a big circle, you can have a big circle, but a circle of positive people who support you and lift you up instead of dragging you down. We all need that. We all need that. And another thing you can also do is you can spend time reading positive books. I've been doing that a lot. I always read books, but now I'm doing it like even more. Especially, where I have this downtime, we're in quarantine. So, a book that I got is The Alkaline Diet by Dr. Sebi. I had got that book because I'm really interested in the alkaline diet, which I was a vegan years ago. But, some things that I didn't know then, what I know now, what I'm saying? It's always room to grow. And, and my favorite pastime, this is my favorite pastime since I am a singer-songwriter. Finding artists and, underground music and stuff that people have never heard before. Like, I love that. That's my thing. I've been doing that for years. It's like a hobby of mine. Before I had over 15,000 of music and artists from all genres, and my hard drive crashed. So, it's like they always say, back up the backup, but I didn't, and I lost all that music. But however, I know I can get it again, at least try to get it again. But however, just try to, do that, incorporate it, with that, and try to have that way of, creating that positive environment so that you can, have a peaceful home and a peaceful mind, on a daily basis, when you go to sleep and when you wake up. All right, guys. All right. So number 3. All right. Step number 3. Yes. So express your feelings. There is a limitless list of feelings. We could name many of them out there. So many out there. I can just start off by naming them. Frustration, procrastination, anger, annoyance, sadness, confusion, nerves, stress, anxiety, panic, etc. Those are all of our feelings that we feel on a daily basis. Yes, we feel those feelings. But most likely, you'll be able to reduce it to one or a combination. You get some that feel it all like myself, or just one. There is a lot of things, that keep happening on a daily basis in our lives, which we hold inside ourselves. We tend to hold on to a lot, more than what we know, more than we need to hold on to. And when we express those emotions, we feel a relief, right? Some of us do. See, now if we do that, if we express it in that manner, it's healthy. If we express it in a healthy way, a way that we can express our feelings in a positive way and protect our energy, we do this to identify the emotion. That's how it's supposed to be done, right? If we do feel those emotions, if we do feel all those feelings. Now, stop for a minute, take a deep breath once again and connect with yourself. This episode is about connecting with ourselves. Okay. So we need to accept and embrace that emotion that we're feeling each and every time. Each and every time, no matter what it is. All right. We need to give ourselves permission to feel it and express it. Just like somebody has said something to you, that you feel as though it's not right. We need to stand in it, feel it, and then express how we feel. Another thing is you should always have someone trustworthy you could talk to, and someone who can understand what you're going through. And if you don't find that right person, or you can just write it down. Because writing is another super therapeutic way of releasing emotions. Now, write without thinking. Don't worry about the grammar. Write whatever comes to your mind. There's nothing wrong in writing swear words, just cussing and shit. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm trying to, I'm trying my best to control, my language. But however, that is the make of me. And I'm trying to, my best to try to tone it down. But however, I'm working on it. I'm work in progress. And, there's nothing wrong with, writing that because, of course we all politically incorrect. Most of us, majority of us is politically incorrect. We can make the content out to be like that. Whatever you write, is for your emotional health, and no one else has to see it anyway. So if you don't want to keep what you wrote, you can also cross it out and destroy it and throw it away in the trash or burn it even. That's another, ritual that some people do. I know I do that as well. I do rituals as far as like burning of the paper, just to seal it and close it, and put it out there in the universe. But however, we need to express our feelings. It's good to get it out. We need to get out our feelings and not keep it inside, because it will turn into something that we do not want it to turn into. It'll turn into a negative light, or it could turn into, something that we will regret for the rest of our lives, outside of it being negative. So, just try to express it in a way to where it's positive, and then it could be protecting our energy as well in the end. All right. And last but not least, number 4. Step number 4, accept change and find solutions. Most people are a repellent and can't accept the change in their lives. You know how you get those stubborn ones who can't accept change for anything, whether it be, outside of talking about this stuff, protecting energy and positive frame of mind. You get some people who just can't accept the change in their life. They must learn to accept that change will happen, eventually. They're going to eventually learn. You're going to learn today. You know what I'm saying? So we continually go through changes because this is how life, is meant to be. This is how this shit is. You can experience the worst phase of your life, but you should look for a positive aspect and find a solution to your problem. When you train your brain for staying positive in all situations, even tragedy can destroy you. But if you can accept the change that, that is a part of life, it can help you to relax and be more accepting when that tragedy rolls around in your life. Try to look, for the more positive aspect. For example, let me give you all an example. If you had a bad, job situation, what do? Do you accept it and try to make it better? Possibly, maybe, I don't know. Or maybe this is the chance to make a change for yourself and look for the job you really want. Yes. We protect our energy with the power of positive thinking. We can learn to put negative situations in perspective and to deal with them as they arise on a daily basis. If we do this, it's best for us to do this because, we got to get our frequency up and stay out of that low shit, y'all. Also, what we can do too? We can also ask ourselves if this matter or any situation, will it matter from a year or a month or a week from now or even a day from now? Will it even matter? We really need to do that. We really need to accept it and learn from it and grow from it. All right, so now getting into the number one tip. Now, this is the number one tip that I got from all of this. Now, of course, the best approach to it is that if we want to give the best, of ourselves to the world, we need to love ourselves enough to take ownership over our energy, right? So it's best to just keep these steps in our mind, in our heart, in our soul, in our spirit, or at least try one of these tactics, to clear negative energy when you're feeling your energy levels depleting. It could help protect you from negative energy that may be creeping around the corner. You may not even know it, and it could also call in that more positive light, y'all. All right, now. So there you have it. Those are all of the steps that we can do, to, try our best. Try our best to stay positive and protect our energy in the midst of anything. All right, guys. All right, now, so if you enjoyed and if you found that episode, My Self-Care Wednesday, episode 28, very informative, by all means, leave this sister a 5-star rating. Yes, leave me a 5-star rating. And also leave me a review. Yes, leave me a review. And also follow me on all of my social media. Follow me on Instagram at Creative Lips Podcast. Yes, and also follow me on Twitter at Creative Lips Pod, because I post stuff there too, guys. All right. Now, y'all just have to stay strong. Hang in there. We can do this. We're all in this together, y'all. We are. I know some of y'all probably might say, I ain't in this together with you, with people who you don't like. But come on, y'all. We are in this together. We ain't going nowhere. So, come on, guys. All right. Until next time. You are now listening to episode 28 of the Creative Bliss Podcast.
Yeah.